What if I told you the most breathtaking building in the ancient world was built in silence? So silent that no clang of metal tools was ever heard. That's exactly how Solomon's temple began. Let me take you back in time. 30 centuries ago, in the heart of ancient Israel, there stood a vision so audacious it challenged imagination itself. It was not merely a shrine or a palace. It was a testament to faith, craftsmanship, and divine purpose. This was Solomon's temple, soaring to a height of 30 meters, its inner walls cloaked with tons of gold, its massive bronze pillars standing 8 meters tall, and every surface fashioned from cedar wood of the finest quality. Yet more extraordinary than its grand dimensions was how it was built, without cranes, without pulley systems made of metal, without modern wheels or engine power. Every colossal block of stone, some weighing up to 400 tons, was cut, transported, and assembled with millimeter precision. Ancient engineers and modern scholars alike stare in awe, struggling to explain the method behind the miracle. Imagine that. A building so splendid, so perfectly constructed, that no chisel strike, no hammer blow, no metallic instrument could ever be heard on construction grounds. That was a solemn command. Not a sound of metal tools shall be heard within the temple walls. How could an ancient workforce, with only stone, wood, water, and sheer human labor, bring such a vision into reality? What secrets lay hidden in rock quarries, mountain trails, and the workshops of tympanum, bronze, and gold? In the following journey, we'll uncover the secrets of those quarries and forests, reconstruct the method by which colossal stones inch by inch traveled over hills and valleys, and reveal the artisans who turned metal into shimmering wonder. Together, we'll follow the invisible threads from the heart of a mountain to the sacred mountain of the temple. So let's begin from the whence and how the giant stones were born and delivered to their holy home, transition into body. And our first stop is a quarry, where thousands of hands labor to cut and shape these massive stones, without producing a single ring of metal-on-stone sound. The quarry was alive before dawn. Under the pale glow of early morning, thousands of men stood ready. Some were barefoot, others wrapped in cloth soaked in dew. They faced the massive cliffs that would soon yield the foundation of God's dwelling place. But there was one rule that set this construction apart from any other in human history. No metal could touch the sacred stones. Instead of chisels and hammers, the builders used knowledge, ancient, refined, and almost forgotten. Long grooves were cut into the rock face with stone blades harder than flint. Into those narrow slits, they placed dry wooden wedges. Then came the buckets of water. As the wood drank, it expanded, and the sound of cracking thunder rolled through the quarry. The mountain itself split open, silently obeying human hands guided by faith. Each fragment of rock that fell was marked with symbols, quiet messages between artisans, telling where each block would belong in the grand design. Every curve, every edge, every dimension had a match a place that most workers would never see with their own eyes. The stones, once released from a mountain's heart, began a journey just as miraculous as their creation, the journey of giants. Imagine the path from those quarries to Jerusalem, miles of uneven earth, steep inclines and narrow valleys. There were no wheels strong enough to bear such weight, no engines to drive them forward. Instead, the stones were moved by pure human coordination. 70,000 men hauled ropes thicker than a man's wrist. Wooden rollers carved from olive trunks served as makeshift wheels. Hundreds pushed and pulled in rhythm, chanting ancient words to keep their movements in unison. When one group tired, another stepped in. It was a symphony of muscle and determination, and sometimes of tragedy. History tells us that some of those ropes snapped. When they did, the silence of obedience turned into screams of terror. Entire teams were crushed beneath the sliding stone, yet the work continued. For 7 years, the stones rolled over soil, dust, and the sweat of those who believed they were not just building a structure, they were raising a promise. As the stones reached Jerusalem, they waited outside the sacred hill. The site itself, Mount Moriah, was said to be the very ground where Abraham once prepared to sacrifice his son Isaac. Now, centuries later, another act of devotion would rise there, not one of offering, but of dwelling. The mountain that had witnessed obedience would now host glory, the timber from the north. But stone alone could not complete the vision. For the walls, ceilings, and inner chambers, Solomon desired the finest material on earth. The cedar of Lebanon, tall, fragrant, nearly immortal when known to resist decay. High in the snowy mountains of Lebanon, men from the city of Tyre swung bronze axes into trunks that had stood for centuries. These trees, which seemed eternal, fell in submission to a divine plan. The logs were bound together with ropes, dragged to the coast, and tied into enormous rafts. Imagine the sight. Entire forests floating across the Mediterranean Sea, pushed by wind and current, shimmering under golden sunlight. Fishermen paused their nets just to watch the great procession of timber heading south, a silent fleet of trees bound for God's house. When those rafts reached the port of Joppa, they were disassembled, and the logs were dragged inland by oxen and men through rough, hilly paths, over 60 kilometers uphill. Every step was a reminder that holiness was never easy. Every pull, an echo of faith turned into action. Solomon's alliance with King Hiram of Tyre made this possible. The two rulers shared not only trade but vision. One saw earthly riches, the other sought heavenly presence. Together, they united the power of nations to honor the God of Israel. The work without sound. As the building began, something remarkable happened. Silence. On the Temple Mount, no hammer, no chisel, no metal tool was ever heard. Stones fitted perfectly into place, as though guided by unseen hands. The workers moved like shadows, communicating with gestures more than words. Every corner rose in sacred quietness, echoing the reverence of heaven. Each stone already carried its destiny. The markings made in the quarries became instructions to the builders, allowing the massive structure to rise without a single correction. Some historians compare it to assembling a divine puzzle, each piece chosen long before the first wall stood. And so, day by day, the silent masterpiece grew taller. Walls lined with cedar soon enclosed the holy space. The air smelled of sap and sun-baked dust, of sweat and prayer. There was exhaustion, yes, but also wonder. Men realized they were not just laborers. They were participants in a covenant made visible, the master craftsmen of bronze. When the structure finally took form, Solomon called upon a man known for his genius, Hiram Abiff, also called Huram, a craftsman from Tyre whose skill in bronze was unmatched. Some say his hands could bend metal like clay, shaping it as though he knew the language of fire. Under his direction, giant furnaces were built outside the city. Day and night, flames roared as molten bronze flowed like rivers of light. From that fire emerged the two pillars, Jachin and Boaz, each over 8 meters tall, crowned with intricate capitals decorated with pomegranates and lilies. Their names meant he will establish, and in him is strength. They were not merely decoration. They were symbols, reminders that the temple stood not by human effort alone, but by divine establishment and power. Huram's team also forged a sea of bronze, an enormous basin that rested upon 12 oxen figures, each facing outward to the 4 directions. It held over 40,000 liters of water used by priests to purify themselves before entering the sacred courts. By day, the sunlight danced upon its surface. By night, the flames of torches turned the bronze into a glowing pool of fire. To the people, it was as though the heavens themselves had descended into the courtyard. Gold, the light of heaven. But Solomon had promised that this temple would not merely stand. It would shine. So came the gold, mountains of it, from Ophir and Sheba, from the stores of Israel's treasury, and from tributes of distant lands. Gold poured into Jerusalem. It was beaten into thin sheets and laid upon the cedar walls. It covered the floors, the ceilings, even the carved cherubim that spread their wings across the inner chamber. When the final lamps were lit, their flames reflected endlessly across the golden surfaces. Witnesses said it was like standing inside the sun, a space where light and faith became one. The high priests moved slowly within, their robes whispering against the golden walls. Every reflection reminded them that this was not man's glory. It was a mirror of God's radiance on earth. The people behind the glory. Behind every magnificent scene were faces. Thousands of them. The quarrymen, the log carriers, the rope pullers, the smiths, the artisans, the overseers. Each had a story, a wound, a dream. Some never saw the finished temple. Others died long before the last stone was set. But in every layer of gold, every plank of cedar, their legacy was sealed. For them, this was more than work. It was worship in motion. Every hand that lifted a stone believed they were lifting a prayer. Every drop of sweat was an offering. In their struggle, the sacred and the human became one. 7 years of faith. 7 years. That's how long it took. 7 years of sunrise over scaffoldings, of torches burning through the night, of chants echoing through the valley as men labored in rhythm. 7 years where heaven seemed to touch the earth. And when at last the final stone was placed, the silence broke, not with noise but with awe. Trumpets sounded, choirs sang, and the Ark of the Covenant was brought into its resting place within the Holy of Holies. As the priest stepped back, a cloud, brilliant, thick and living, filled the temple. It was a Shekinah, the divine presence. The same presence that once guided Israel by fire and cloud in the wilderness now chose to dwell among them again. No architect, no craftsman, no king could claim the credit. The glory belonged to the one for whom the temple was built. The legacy of the temple. Centuries would pass. The temple would face destruction, rebuilding, and memory. But what endured was not the gold or stone. It was the idea that faith could be built, that devotion could take shape, that human hands could raise something worthy of the divine. Even today, when we hear about Solomon's temple, we are not just learning history. We are remembering a time when heaven and earth met in the labor of men who believed. The temple was not only a building, it was a bridge, connecting the seen and unseen, the temporal and eternal. The air still shimmered with the echo of trumpets. Smoke from the sacrifices curled upward, blending with the golden light that poured from the temple doors. The people stood in awe, their faces reflecting both sunlight and tears. For the first time, they beheld the completed dwelling place of the Most High, a vision that had once been only a dream in Solomon's heart. As the last note faded, a stillness settled over the crowd. Then it happened. A cloud descended, thick, brilliant, alive, filling every chamber, every hallway, every breath of air. The priests, overwhelmed, stepped back. The people bowed low, unable to look directly into the radiance that poured from within. Scripture calls the Shekinah the visible glory of God. And in that moment, all the toil, the pain, the loss, the endless labor of 7 years found its purpose. The temple was no longer just stone and gold. It had become a vessel for presence. Heaven had touched earth. A king's prayer. King Solomon stepped forward. His robe shimmered with the same light that poured from the Holy of Holies. Lifting his hands, he spoke, not to the people, but to the one whose glory now filled the temple. He prayed not for power, but for mercy, not for riches, but for remembrance, that God would hear the cries of his people, whether they prayed within those golden walls or from the farthest corners of exile, that even when they failed, when their hearts turned away, they might still look toward this place and find forgiveness. It was a prayer that would echo through centuries, because Solomon, in all his wisdom, knew what many still forget. No temple, no structure, no empire can contain God. The temple was a symbol, not a cage. It was never meant to trap heaven, only to invite it. And as Solomon's voice trembled through the air, the people shouted Amen, their sound rolling across the hills of Jerusalem like thunder after rain. The Golden Age. In the years that followed, Israel flourished. Pilgrims from distant lands came to see the golden temple glinting beneath the sun. Envoys from Egypt, Sheba, and Tyre stood in awe, whispering that no kingdom on earth shone so brightly. Trade routes opened, songs were written, and peace filled the valleys. For a time, it seemed the promise had been fulfilled, that heaven's order had finally taken root among men. But as generations passed, gold began to tarnish, not on the walls, but in hearts. The temple still stood, magnificent and unmoved, yet the spirit that once filled it began to fade. Not because God had changed, but because the people had. When glory fades, history tells us that centuries later, Babylonian armies marched upon Jerusalem. The city burned. The temple, that wonder of wonders, was torn apart stone by stone. Gold melted under the fire of war. The great bronze pillars were broken down, carried away as spoils. And once again, The mountain of Moriah stood bare, as if time itself had turned the page. People wept by the rivers of Babylon, remembering the days when God's glory dwelled among them. They asked, "Why did he leave us?" But the truth was not abandonment. It was distance born of disobedience. The temple had fallen, but its meaning endured, because even as the walls crumbled, the covenant, the promise, remained alive in the hearts of those who still believed. A new dwelling. Generations later, a carpenter from Nazareth would walk the same hill Solomon once ruled. He would stand near the temple's remnants and say something that startled everyone. "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." People thought he was speaking of the stone building, but he was talking about himself. In those words, the purpose of Solomon's temple was fulfilled. The dwelling place of God was no longer confined to cedar and gold. It had taken the form of a living man, and through him, that divine presence would one day dwell in every heart that believed. So perhaps the story of Solomon's temple isn't just about architecture or ancient glory. Perhaps it's about a lesson that what begins in stone must end in spirit, that the true temple is not a monument we build, but a relationship we keep, echoes through time. Even today, archaeologists still search for remnants of the first temple. Some claim to have found fragments of foundation stones. Others believe its treasures remain hidden, buried beneath centuries of earth in silence. But maybe the real treasure isn't buried at all. Maybe it lives in the idea that faith, when shaped by obedience, can outlast even the strongest walls. Every time a person chooses forgiveness over anger, every time love triumphs over pride, another temple rises, unseen but eternal. Solomon's builders used cedar, gold, and stone. We build with patience, hope, and grace. And though our hands may never lift a stone in Jerusalem, our hearts can still become a dwelling place for light. The final reflection. As the sun set behind the hills of Zion, the golden temple once shimmered like a second sun on earth. Birds flew across the orange sky, and from its courts, songs of praise drifted through the valley. No one then could have known how fleeting that golden age would be, but perhaps that's the beauty of all sacred things. They remind us that glory is not meant to be kept, but shared. 3,000 years later, we still speak of it, not because of its wealth, but because of its wonder. The Temple of Solomon stands forever in memory as a bridge between human hands and divine will, between dust and divinity, between what we can see and what we can only believe. So when you look up at the night sky, remember this. Every star that burns above you once looked down upon that temple, and still bears witness to the same God who chose to dwell not in walls of gold, but in hearts that seek him. And maybe, just maybe, that's where the story was always meant to lead.